Welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. This is my review of Nuremberg. Now, there won't be specific plot spoilers in this review, but I will be talking about the key themes and giving my view of the underlying messages of the film. So if you haven't seen it yet, it might be best to come back to this after you have. So Nuremberg is the new release from director, screenwriter and producer James Vanderbilt. Now, he's previously worked on films including Zodiac, the Scream franchise and White House Down. And he also wrote the screenplay for this movie, and that was adapted from the 2013 book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist by Jack L. Hay. And that book documented the relationship between US Army psychiatrist Dr. Douglas Kelley and the high-ranking Nazis that he was assigned to evaluate, one of which was Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. Now, we've got a star-studded cast for this film, with Russell Crowe playing Goering, Rami Malek playing Dr. Kelley, and then a supporting cast including Michael Shannon as the US's lead prosecutor, Richard E. Grant as the UK's prosecutor, Leo Woodall as the US Army's German translator, and Lottie Verbeek, who plays Goering's wife. And I'm sure most people will know the outline history of this story, but the central premise is that following the end of World War II, the surviving members of the Nazi High Command are captured by the Allies or turn themselves in, and there needs to be some sort of mechanism to bring these people to justice for the atrocities committed. And what then follows is the Nuremberg trials, in which the Americans, the French, the British and the Russians establish an international court for that purpose. So it's important to say at the outset that technically this film is absolutely excellent. The writing, the editing, the cinematography, the score, the attention to detail as a period piece. It's all just extremely high quality. And in terms of the story itself, there's really two strands to this movie. The first is the gradual political and legal build-up to the trials, and the Allied methodology to ensuring that Nazism or anything like it could never come about again. And that part of the film, led by Michael Shannon's Justice Jackson, that looks at the processes and procedures that led up to the trial and what the Allies hoped to achieve by going through the process. And it gives a sense that the Allies sort of saw the trial as a way to box off the Nazi experiment, to highlight that this was basically a historical anomaly and to delegitimize it in the eyes of the world so that it couldn't happen again. But the second and perhaps more important strand of the movie is the development in the relationship between Goering and Dr. Kelley. And that's the emotional heart of this movie and its driving force. And the performances of Russell Crowe as Goering and also Rami Malek as Kelley are absolutely brilliant. And they really elevate the film, in my opinion. It's obvious that Crowe is going to get most of the plaudits for what is an absolutely superb performance. And I'm sure he's going to be in with a shout for an Oscar for this. There's a sort of heft to his performance, I suppose, and really in more ways than one. So he really bulked up for this role, as you can see from the pictures on screen. And there were a few references throughout the film to him being fat, but it's just Goering's sort of smugness, his inner confidence, his sort of self-assuredness that Crowe absolutely nails. And his accent is even pretty good as well. Of course, you don't want to lionise Goering for obvious reasons, but he was a substantial historical figure, and Crowe really reflects that in his performance. And then Malek is also excellent in his portrayal as Dr. Kelley. And because the film rests on the relationship between Kelley and Goering, and as Crowe, put on such a masterclass performance as Goering, Malek had to bring his A game, and I think he did exactly that, really. He's full of intensity and ambition, but there's also an underlying kind of fragility and wide-eyed innocence to his performance, and that's a key component to the film's sort of central premise, because throughout there's a sort of fascinating dance going on between Goering and Dr. Kelley. And there's this constant tension at play, this notion of one-upmanship, of who is really in control here and how is each individual playing the other or using the other to advance their respective agenda. I think Goering really serves as a reference point for this film in that sense, essentially for the ambitions and hopes of others. So throughout the film, Justice Jackson talks a lot about, I'm going to beat him, I'm going to show him up in court. And Dr. Kelley also makes sort of frequent reference to the book that he's going to write about his interactions with Goering. And there's a sort of skillful portrayal through the writing of Goering as antagonist to each man's hopes and desires, but also representative of some part of those characters and what drives them. So we see that their ambitions and hopes are seen through their interactions with him and then reflected back to us through him. And that's what I found most compelling about this movie, that they successfully managed to show that Goering and the other Germans in the Nazi high command were not cardboard cutout, monsters or simple caricatures of evil. These were ambitious, self-serving people, probably narcissists or sociopaths, who found themselves in an ideological machine where they could enact evil acts with impunity just at the stroke of a pen. And I think one of the key messages of the film is that these people were not unique to Germany. So through the court hearings, we learn that they were there, in positions of power because of the German people's desperation in the 1930s. And we understand that this group of people were then able to take advantage of the desperation of others by scapegoating entire groups of people, by creating a series of bogeymen that they could then point to as the cause of Germany's decline, and which in turn allowed them to maintain and enhance their own position via the apparatus of the Nazi Party. And we get to understand that most of these individual people in positions of power, they could enact these unspeakable horrors because they were in gilded palaces, looking at pieces of paper and spreadsheets, giving orders to minions by decree. And it sort of emphasised that they were spared much of the horror. They were denied really the raw humanity of it all. And Goering's key defence through the trial is that the camps were initially set up as forced labour camps, and that he personally didn't have any knowledge of what happened later. And in the final act, which is the courtroom drama, we see that disconnect and that attempt to maintain plausible deniability from Goering. And what I found most compelling about that was that in many respects he had a normal life. He had a pleasant, attractive wife, he had a daughter who played the piano. What comes across is that, in another context, this could be a guy who could have been a CEO of an S&P 500 company, something like that. So the overriding picture that we get is that none of these people were remarkable. None of them were monsters who butchered children in their spare time. They were just men who found themselves through a historical quirk of fate to be working within an ideological and political machine which gave them full control over everything they surveyed, and which promoted and revered the most self-serving, ambitious and power-hungry types who would do anything to maintain their position. And as I pointed out, Goering didn't want to lose all the trappings of his position. And so we see across the film, what lengths people are willing to go to maintain their position. What are people willing to do to condone or ignore unspeakable horrors if it serves their purpose to do so? And what we see unfold is that Dr. Kelley has this realisation, and so after the trial we see him forlornly trying to warn his fellow countrymen about the risks of this happening elsewhere. And so watching Goering and Dr. Kelley go head to head, and watching Dr. Kelley recognise that the traits in Goering which led to mass murder are also part of his own pathology, I was reminded of that scene in Michael Mann's Manhunter, where Hannibal Lecter says to Will Graham, if you want the scent, smell yourself. Ultimately, some of us are going to be more predisposed to this sort of pathology than others, but ambition, narcissism, pride, the need for control, the desire to subjugate others, the desire for wealth and success. These are things that exist within all of us. And so that takes me then to why this film has been released now. There are really important lessons in this film for the time that we live in. We see across the world, don't we? Authoritarianism is on the rise. People are struggling with the cost of living. Checks and balances on unrestrained power are waning. How many warnings do we need? How close are we to something like this happening again? Well, turn on your TV screens and let's have a look. So overall, this was one of my films of the year. It's absolutely superb technically. It's got great performances from all involved, and it is extremely thought-provoking. So I would highly recommend it. Of course, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.